Now, medical madness. I promised you last week that I was going to explain to you why there's no such thing as arthritis, there's no such thing as high blood pressure, there's no such thing as type 2 diabetes, and here we go. From the holistic perspective, holistic physicians are trained to treat people. We are also trained that illness and dis-ease is a phenomenon which affects the entire system, hence the word holistic. If you have a problem with your right elbow joint, you don't just have a bad right elbow. You have a facultative breakdown across the board in your system because everything is connected. You can make the argument that if you have a parasitic infection or a bacterial infection, for instance, in the lung or in the arm, then you only do have a problem with that part of the body. But that's a different thing. That's the exception that proves the rule. When people have arthritis or type 2 diabetes or high blood pressure, and they go to an MD, which are the only people we've gone to for the last 100 years, so we've been hypnotized into thinking the way that MDs think. But MDs are trained in a type of medicine called reductionism, and reductionism has a very archaic, backwards way of looking at health. It should be outlawed, for goodness sake, from my point of view. The only thing reductionistic medicine is good for is surgery. But reductionism, reductionistic doctors, and trauma. Reductionistic doctors are taught that the human body is nothing's connected inside, that you got to take the body apart and give one medicine for each piece that's broken when somebody's sick, and everything is a standalone unit. So therefore, MDs classify illnesses by their objective signs and symptoms. What the blood work looks like, what the x-ray looks like, what the inflammation looks like, what the skin looks like. They classify everything by stuff that they can measure and codify, and they are completely uninterested in the patient's own, the person's own personal experience of the illness. So when they categorize things like this, like categorizing bugs, right? All the different species of bug, right? They kind of get into that habit. Well, they do exactly the same thing with illness. And when they view illness from a reductionistic point of view, that type of approach works. But illness is not a reductionistic phenomenon. It is a holistic phenomenon. So, for instance, I could have identical triplets. They have exactly the same genes. They're identical triplets, right? Exactly the same genes. They're all in their 20s, and they all develop arthritis. So they all go to the MD. The MD does blood work. The MD does X-ray. The MD does whatever the MD does, and the MD, promotes a definitive diagnosis of osteoarthritis in all three triplets. They all have osteoarthritis. Well, that's great. So what does the MD do? Does the MD treat the person? No, the MD treats the illness. So the MD throws pain medication and anti-inflammatories into the body of the people who have this thing that the MDs are calling arthritis. It doesn't fix anything. Doesn't upset the metabolic balance that made the joints go south in the first place. Does not attend to any of the patient's subjective symptoms at all. A little bit, maybe. But really, the only thing that those treatments do is subdue the symptoms. It's like painting over the mold in the wall. And they're waiting until the joint becomes so decrepit that they're going to cut it out and put a titanium joint in. That's what they're waiting for. They're rubbing their hands in glee and drooling. Can't wait because, they need a new pool. They need a new Maserati. They need a summer house in the Hamptons. They need something. Got to put that joint in because that's how they're taught. But the fact of the matter is that triplet A, his arthritis feels like little pinpricks. And it feels much better if you put a warm application and much worse if you put a cold application on it. Triplet B, his pain is a dull, throbbing ache. The only time it bothers him is when he's using that arm. And when the pain is present, it feels much better from cold applications and much worse from anything hot. Triplet C, the pain that he feels starts in the wrist and moves up to the elbow and then moves back down to the wrist. And every time his arthritis flares up, he also gets flashes of light in his eyes and ringing in his ears and diarrhea. And the only time that his arthritis acts up is right before a rainstorm. This guy is a barometer. Now, they all have completely different subjective symptoms because they're in 3 completely different bodies, even though they have the same gene. So when you look at these people individually from a holistic point of view, you can say not that they have arthritis, because if they had arthritis, their symptoms would all be exactly the same. But they're not. The symptoms are remarkably different. There's some commonality. There's a pain in the joint. There's a problem in the joint. There's an inflammation in the joint. But when you completely leave out of your diagnostic assessment all of the details of all of the ways that illness is making that person feel in all the different parts of the body, you're going to miss the boat. And I'll tell you what happens when you miss the boat when we come back on the other side of the break. Finish up the thought that I started, my little rant in the first part. And by the way, it was Benny Hinn, not Benny Hill. Benny Hill's the comedian, right? Yeah, it was Benny Hill, the guy that raises people from the dead on TV, right? So when holistic physicians work with people who have physical, mental, or emotional trouble, we don't treat arthritis. In this case, to complete the metaphor, we do not treat arthritis because there's no such thing. We can say that this person, in this case triplet A, had a type of arthritis, but we're not treating arthritis because triplet A's complete overall symptomology, which includes how they felt, what their presenting symptoms were, and what their blood work, what their x-rays were, their complete totality of symptoms was extremely different than triplet B or triplet C. They all had very unique symptoms, all of which were built upon the foundation of something wrong with their joints. But the MDs are colorblind to all of these distinctions. All that they see is, there's a problem with the joint. And they're not trained to do anything holistic. They're not trained to look at the healing power of the body. They don't even think that exists. All they're trained to do is throw medicines at the joint. That's all that they do. And the medicines that they throw at the joint are designed to suppress the symptoms. But more importantly, holistic physicians treat the person. And MDs treat the diagnosis. So everybody with the arthritis gets exactly the same thing in the MD's office unless they're allergic to it or unless the MD has access to the brand new designer drug for that particular diagnosis. I've treated thousands of people in my life, and I've never once treated arthritis. I've treated thousands of people in my life. I've never once treated any diagnosis. I can't treat a diagnosis. A diagnosis is not a real thing. It doesn't exist in the real world. You want me to prove it? All right, well, bring me a pen. Can you bring me a pen? Yeah, you can bring me a pen. Can you bring me a piece of pumpkin pie? Yeah, you can bring me a piece of pumpkin pie. Can you bring me some arthritis? I'd like some arthritis, please. Can you bring me some? I'd like some type 2 diabetes. Can you bring me some? No, you can't, because these are intangible concepts that the MD has convinced you are real things. They don't exist in real time. It is a description of a certain set of conditions that happens in the body from an objective reductionistic point of view. It's one piece of the data stream. It's one piece of the data stream only. In order to really know what's going on, you have to add that piece of the data stream to everything else that's happening in the patient. And when you add everything else that's happening in that one individual, you get a treatment for the person, not the illness. We do not treat diagnoses because they don't exist. They're intangible. That's nuts. But the MDs do it all the time. We treat people. So in this case, my clinical treatment in states where I'm licensed for triplet A would be very different than my clinical treatment for triplet B, even though from the MD's point of view, they have exactly the same symptoms. From my point of view, they do not. It's insanity. It is insanity the way that MDs are trained, number one, to look at disease, and number two, how they go about treating it. Alex Jones correctly talks about pharmaceutical profiteering and, how the pharmaceutical industry is changing the rules of medicine, and they're only allowing doctors to work in such a way, and that's correct. But even if that wasn't so, even if MDs had completely free reign to do whatever they wanted without any pharmaceutical intervention whatsoever, their therapeutics would still fail because they are reductionistic. They do not work. You cannot treat a holistic phenomenon with a reductionistic medicine. You can't. That's why they've lost the war on cancer. That's why they've lost the war on heart disease. That's why Alzheimer's and autism and obesity and arthritis and type 2 diabetes are skyrocketing, and why our life expectancies are getting shorter and shorter while the MDs are driving the bus, because their therapeutics don't work. They do not work, because when you use a reductionistic viewpoint and a reductionistic medicine on a holistic phenomenon, it must, by definition, fail. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as arthritis. There's no such thing as type 2 diabetes. But what there are people. People who are suffering mightily. People who are suffering needlessly.